Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Reaching Higher New Hampshire's Looking Ahead to 2023, the education policy trends we're tracking. We are happy to have a full room of participants today and really excited to offer you all an overview of the policy trends that we are monitoring here in the state of New Hampshire and beyond, for that matter, for the year 2023. As many of you know, the legislative session is well underway and as busy as it is going to get, with an active schedule for both our House Education and Senate Education and Workforce Development committees. But before we really get into the heart of today's matter, which is highlighting and detailing those 2023 policy trends, I want to orient you for a moment to Reaching Higher New Hampshire. I know many of you are very familiar with us, but we may have some new participants working and engaging with us today, so I do not want to make any assumptions about who we are and what we do. So Reaching Higher New Hampshire is the state's Education Policy Resource Center. We're built on this vision that all students, regardless of location, deserve a really high quality, rigorous, student-centered, and just education system that prepares them for college or careers immediately after their secondary experience, and most importantly, for life in general. And we work to accomplish that vision by offering decision makers, so sort of grass tops leaders, all the way down to grassroots, being our communities, our schools, members of school administration, with the research and information they need to make the best possible decisions for the students and families that they engage with in their communities. And really our work in that area falls into three broad buckets. And the first is that we contextualize the issues for folks. So not just looking at them discretely, but really looking at the mosaic of issues and what the implications are. We pride ourselves on informing communities about what is taking place here in Concord and how that impacts the operations of our schools. And most importantly, we enjoy engaging you all in these really healthy and critically important conversations. So with that background, I'm going to mute myself and I'm going to pass the baton over to our Director of Policy, and that is Christina Pretorius. And you will also note joining us today with our Reaching Higher team is Matt Girding, who is also our Policy Analyst. So Christina, it's all yours.
Great. Thanks so much, Nicole. And thank you everyone for being here. This is a really exciting time of year for Reaching Higher. We're tracking over 130 pieces of legislation this session. And so there is a lot to cover in this hour. I'm not going to be able to cover everything. These are really just the big highlights. We will have more sessions in the coming weeks on specific topics. This next hour is really just meant to orient people on the big broad themes, specific bills that may be of interest to people. If you have any questions at all, drop them in the Q&A box. We will try to get to them, and if not, we will certainly be following up. And then another way to really stay informed and engaged about this is by signing up for our New Hampshire Education Network. That is a group of interested individuals who are really passionate, interested in public education policy, public education on the ground, those kinds of things. This year, we do have a new thing where we are emailing people weekly at the beginning of the week to let them know of, what happened last week and what's coming up this next week, what public hearings there are, what are their meetings, how can people stay engaged and involved. So that is something that may be of interest to people. But with that, I really just want to get started and really start it off with an overview of what state leadership looks like right now. So in November, voters elected Governor Chris Sununu for another term. He is a Republican governor On our executive council, we have 4 Republicans, 1 Democrat. That is the same split as the last biennium. There are a couple of new faces on there. In terms of the state house, in the state Senate, we have 14 Republicans, 10 Democrats. Again, that's the same split as the last biennium, but there are new faces again there, especially in the Senate Education Committee. For our state representatives in Reps Hall, it is really a razor thin margin this biennium, this year. So it will definitely make for really interesting session days. There are 201 Republicans, 197 Democrats right now, with 2 vacancies. And so, we will be watching really closely. One thing that does mean is that those committees are split evenly between Republicans and Democrats. As you'll see. So here we have membership on these 2 education committees. There are other committees that we will be following, whether that's finance, whether that's ways and means, whether that's municipal and county government. But these 2 committees are really the ones where we spend the most of our time tracking policy and that kind of thing. And then once these bills go out of them, some do go to finance, some do go to other committees. And so we'll be watching there as well. But we thought it would be worth giving an overview of sort of who's on the committee, who are we working with most day to day. So on the House Education Committee, it is evenly split, 10 Republicans, 10 Democrats. Chairman Rick Ladd, he's a Republican from Haverhill. He is chairing it again. And then Vice Chair Glenn Cordelli, again, he was vice chair last year. And then the clerk is Oliver Ford. And so the members are listed here. There are a number of really new faces. And, in terms of membership on the committee, it really spans a pretty wide range. There are former educators, there are former school administrators, there are quite a few families, representatives here who have homeschooled their children, represented the homeschooling community. And so we're seeing a much different flavor and vibe this year than I think we will have seen years past. On the Senate Education Committee, it is split 3 Republicans, 2 Democrats. Senator Ruth Ward is returning as chair. As vice chair, we have a new senator on the committee, and she's a new senator in the state Senate, actually, Carrie Gendreau. And then there are a couple of new members. Donovan Fenton is new. Timothy Lang is new to the committee, and then Suzanne Prentice is returning to that committee. So we see a lot of new faces this year, a lot of returning faces, but it will for sure be a really interesting session. And so next, we just wanted, before we really dive into key trends and specific bills, I did just want to give a really brief update on really the state of education. Over the past 2 months, there's been a significant amount of data that had been released from the Department of Education. So we just wanted to go through that very quickly, just to give people an idea so that when we start talking about legislation, we really have that foundational knowledge of, what do our schools look like today? What does enrollment look like today? School funding and student needs. So getting really into the meat and the new data that had just been released over the past couple of weeks. Enrollment data was just released. These are numbers based on October 1st, 2022 counts. So this is this school year. And we find that the majority of New Hampshire families continue to choose public schools for their children. 9 out of every 10 students in school-age youth in New Hampshire attend a public school. Whether that's a district school or a public charter school, they're in those public schools. 86% of students attend a public district school, 9% of students are attending private schools, 3% in charters, and 2% of our students are homeschooled. And as far as changes in student enrollment between last year and this year, there have been some pretty significant changes. So public school district enrollment, these are your community schools, your neighborhood schools, your district run schools. That enrollment has decreased by about 1%, which is consistent with what we've seen year over year for about the past 2 decades. That number has been steadily decreasing, largely due to demographic shifts in the state. The average age of the state is increasing, and there are just fewer school-age children in the state. Private school enrollment has dropped about 3%, which is consistent with prior years as well. And then homeschool enrollment has dropped 15% since last year alone. So that was a pretty dramatic drop. Public charter school enrollment has increased by 12%. That is a pretty large number. A lot of that increase is due to 3 new charter schools that have opened as of fall 2022. So this year we have 3 new charter schools in the state, and that's really driving a lot of that growth in charter school enrollment. And we're expecting to see a continuation of that increase in enrollment because by the end of this year, 2023, we're expecting about 4 new charter schools to be applying to open with it before the state board. So there could be as many as 4 new charter schools opening by the end of this year. So we really do expect that enrollment to continue to rise. I will say that overall, between 2021 and 2022, there was a dip in the overall number of school-aged youth in New Hampshire. There are about 2,400 fewer school-aged youth in the state this year than there were last year. And so, we're seeing that in a variety of different ways. But one other thing to really note here when we're talking about student enrollment is that it is unclear whether enrollment data, homeschool enrollment or private school enrollment, include students who participate in the state school voucher program, those education freedom accounts or EFAs. They might include them, they might not. The New Hampshire Department of Education doesn't have information on whether students who are reporting to their districts as homeschooled or reporting to those private schools as enrolled are also enrolled in that school voucher program. So that dip in homeschool enrollment, some of that may be attributed to students who enroll in the voucher program. It may not. The state just does not have that data available. So that's something that's really important to remember when we talk about enrollment dips and jumps in enrollment as well.
Christina, there was just a quick question on that as well.
Sure.
And I think the next slide may best answer it, but it was in regards to whether changes in homeschool enrollment were due to lifts and restrictions for COVID.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I think this next chart might answer that question a little bit. If not, please drop it into the Q&A again. But we did see this really strong jump in homeschool enrollment in 2020, which was really the start of the pandemic. Since then, enrollment in homeschool has dropped by about 40%. And so it's pretty close to pre-pandemic levels. And so, that could be due to a number of different things. These homeschool students are going to private schools, they're re-enrolling in their public district schools. There may be some homeschooling students who enroll in VLACs in the state's online charter school, so they would be counted as charter school students. Or, sometimes students just move out of the state, and we see that pretty often. Over the past couple of years with changes in home prices and all of that kind of stuff. So, but I think the key thing to know here is that, yes, that is correct, that homeschool enrollment has dropped since 2020 by about 40% and is returning to those pre-pandemic levels. And so with that, having an idea of sort of what's happening in enrollment, where are our students going to school, all of those kinds of things, let's dive into the key themes because there are quite a few of them. So the big broad strokes of what we'll be talking about today and what we're tracking this year particularly are school funding, school building aid, privatization, whether that's school vouchers or other pieces, school climate bills, that includes things like divisive concepts repeal, parental bill of rights, all of those other different kinds of bills. And then another key piece that is relatively new to our big themes, but is one that we are also really interested in, are efforts to strengthen and diversify the educator workforce. This has really emerged in the past couple of years and has really intensified over the past year. And so we're seeing a lot of legislation being proposed to address those pieces as well. But really, first, to kick it off, it is a budget year. It happens every 2 years. This is the year for it. With the last budget in 2021, that was an extremely consequential budget for education policy, a number of other issue areas as well. But in the state budget last time in 2021, they passed the Divisive Concepts Law, they passed the statewide school voucher program, they passed the $100 million statewide education property tax cut, and a number of other things. So, as we move on, the budget is just absolutely increasingly important because it is a vehicle, it can be a vehicle to pass non-budget, non-financial legislation as well. So, we're hearing from agencies, from budget writers and state budget analysts, they predict that New Hampshire will end this fiscal year, which ends on June 30th, with a $283 million surplus. That is quite large. It is lower than last year. Last year, we had a $361 million surplus, but $283 million is sizable. And again, that could change. That's really based on projections for the next 6 or so months. But that's sort of what we're working with and what lawmakers are heading into this legislative session with. It is a big topic of conversation. The governor in his inaugural speech, other lawmakers are really focusing on the budget. How will they use this surplus? How will they use these funds? How will they allocate it? One of the biggest trends that we've been hearing in terms of the budget is really around, I would call it fiscal restraint. So we're hearing a lot of talk about an impending recession, tightening the belt, that kind of thing. So that's something that going into this legislative session, this biennium, this budget writing year, that is something that we will be watching really, really closely is, lawmakers, the governor is really interested in doing things like funding surplus funds for one-time expenses, that kind of thing, and really putting that money into rainy day fund and things like that. So that's really going to change conversations around how will we fund things and that including schools and that kind of thing. So that is something that we will be watching really, really closely. Diving into school funding, giving just a quick overview of what school funding has looked like over the past couple of years. Between 2023, which is this current year that we are in, this is fiscal year 23, we're expecting state aid for schools to drop pretty significantly till next year. These estimates are published in November by the Department of Education, and they're expecting a little over $100 million dip in state funding for education. A lot of that could be attributed to that $100 million statewide education property tax cut. So if you'll remember, as part of the last budget, lawmakers put in this property tax cut where they reduced the amount, statutorily, the state collects $363 million in statewide property tax. They reduced that to $263 million. And so the state stepped in to replace that $100 million. So that was sort of an increase in state funding, although budgets didn't necessarily change. It was more of a shifting of the source of revenue than it was adding revenue or taking it away. And so that is ending at the end. That was only for FY23. And so now we're seeing that the impact of that reduction in FY24. There are other reasons why state aid is decreasing. One is that slow and steady decrease in enrollment. We also see fewer students who are enrolled in free and reduced lunch. The state does provide funding for each student who is enrolled in the school meal programs. And now that there's a reduction of students who are enrolled in the program, that funding also goes down. And then there are a couple of other reasons why as well that we can dig into at a later date, but I want to get moving to the next slide, which is, this looks at specifically students enrolled in school meals. So that state funding for students who are enrolled in school meals is really important to districts. And we see that between FY23 and FY24, there is a pretty significant drop, almost $10 million in the amount that the state is providing for school districts. This is due to fewer students participating in the school-based free and reduced meal programs. There is an estimated 37,000 students participating, which is consistent with years with last year's numbers. However, last year the state was able to use pre-pandemic free and reduced lunch counts when there were more students participating in the program. This is really important because while the number of students participating in these school meal programs are lower than pre-pandemic, state and national experts warn that there could be as many, if not more than pre-pandemic. It's just those students aren't enrolling in those meal programs. And so the need is there. Those schools still need to provide services and supports for students. It's just those students aren't enrolling in meal programs, and so they're not receiving that funding for those students. And on that note, we know that student needs are increasing really across the board. In the past 10 years, the percentage of students navigating poverty as measured by free and reduced lunch participation, students qualifying for special education services and or qualifying for English language services has gone up pretty significantly. This has a number of impacts on our local schools, on our communities, and our state on a number of different levels, including school funding, including the services provided for students. And so that is something that we are looking at pretty closely. There has been a lot of conversation around increases in cost per pupil and those kinds of other metrics due to a variety of different factors. And we do plan on having more resources and analysis on that. But I think it's really important that people understand that, yes, while enrollment is declining, those student needs are increasing. So the proportions of students who qualify for school meals, who receive those special education services, who receive services for English language, those numbers are increasing. And so schools need to be providing those resources, providing those services. So that's something to keep in mind when we talk about cost per pupil and declining enrollment. And so now that we have sort of an overview of school funding, let's dive right into the school funding bills. So there are a number of school funding bills this year. It's unclear, I don't have a crystal ball, so I don't know which ones are going to gain more traction than others. I wish I did, but these are the ones that we're really keeping tabs on. So House Bill 540, both 540 and 577 increase funding for special education, but in different ways. So House Bill 540 increases funding if a student receives services all day, partial day, or if they're placed out of school or in residential facilities. So it kind of takes, what services do schools need to provide, and then it sort of tailors funding based on that. House Bill 577 increases the state's liability for costs associated with special ed services. So currently the state steps in and helps districts pay for services. If a student requires if those services that student requires cost more than 3.5 times the average state cost per pupil, this would lower it to 1.5 times. So the state would be stepping in a lot sooner for students who require really advanced services. House Bill 334. This one is a pretty broad bill. It tries to tackle the school funding debate from a different angle. So this one takes the average state cost per pupil and it increases state funding to half of that. So right now it's about $19,000 is the average cost per pupil. That would mean that the state would pay nearly $10,000 per pupil. Right now, it's about It's an average of roughly $5,000. So it would be quite when you think about differentiating all those pieces. So that's quite a jump. And so it takes a different angle to that school funding debate. House Bill 649 is one that we're also watching. That one just straight up repeals the statewide education property tax. There's been some conversation around that one. I think the intent of it is really to get the conversation started around how do we fund our schools, and really what's the most effective way to do so. How should we pay for our schools? What should the proportion of state to local funding be, and that kind of thing. So that's one that we're also watching. House Bill 529, that one restores the fiscal capacity disparity aid and enhanced free and reduced lunch. Those are two targeted funding streams that targeted state funding to communities based on their tax capacity and based on student need. Those two specific funding streams were cut in 2021. When they were in place, they provided about $60 million to districts with the highest need. And so House Bill 529 would restore those funding sources. And then House Bill 435, this one is an interesting one. So this one would align the current funding streams, targeted funding streams. It's called a quote relief grant, but it is a static amount of money. It is not adjusted for inflation in the way that other other state funding sources are. This one would make sure that relief funding is aligned to those inflationary adjustments in the same way that the state funding formula is. So it wouldn't be a static amount from year to year. It would be adjusted based on inflation, using the same sort of formula that other school funding formulas are. One of the other pieces, and this one kind of blends a couple of different themes, House Bill 440. So this would allow the state to use education trust fund money to fund the school voucher program. This one is an interesting one. So there is a lawsuit challenging the way that the state pays for the school voucher program. The Education Trust Fund in statute can only be used to fund public schools, charter schools, but it's the Education Trust Fund is meant to pay for the state's public district and charter schools. It's in statute. And so there's a lawsuit challenging the voucher program because it's pulling from the Education Trust Fund. House Bill 440 would write in statute that the Education Trust Fund could be used to pay for the school voucher program. And so this is one that we are watching really closely. There is no cap on the school voucher program. So regardless of how much it costs, the state has to pay it. And it's paid for out of the Education Trust Fund. And for every dollar that's paid for with vouchers, it essentially takes $1 away from money available for our public schools. If there's a surplus in the Education Trust Fund, it's usually used for specific grants for public and charter schools. And so that is something that we are watching really, really closely. There's also a bill that has not yet been introduced. It's a Senate bill, and that increases the state contribution to retirement system for certain employers, including school districts. So state contributions to the retirement system, they've been a big issue for local districts and towns for a while now. The state has reduced its contribution in the past, so taxpayers have had to make up that difference. This bill hasn't been introduced yet, so we don't have a lot of detail on it, but it is one that I think municipalities, towns, school districts will be watching relatively closely. So we're putting it on the watch list. Switching gears just a bit and kind of going parallel, school building aid. This is another big theme this year. So there are a number of bills regarding the school building aid program. House Bill 546 would increase the school building amount to at least $50 million per year. And that's in addition to the debt service, that tail is what a lot of people call it. So right now, the way that the statute is written, the state law says that lawmakers can do up to $50 million, and that would include that tail. which I believe is somewhere between 10 and $20 million. So they're still paying off $10 to $20 million per year in grants that they've already funded. And so that's, that those sort of bonds that have been years, they made them a couple of years ago and they're still making those annual payments. And so that eats at the amount that's available for new school building aid projects. House Bill 546 would increase that to $50 million plus whatever that debt service is. So it would be $50 million in new projects. House Bill 541 is very similar. It increases the school building aid to at least $50 million. It doesn't include that debt service piece though. So that would just be, at least $50 million. It could go over, but it's that floor is $50 million, including the debt service, that tail. House Bill 332 is another one that we're watching. That one increases the school building aid to at least $60 million plus that debt service. So, $60 million in new projects that doesn't include that tail. One thing that's interesting about this one, though, is that at least $5 million per year can be used to fund construction and renovation that districts did during that 10 to 12 year moratorium when the state did not fund school building aid at all. So school districts would be able to pursue some funding to help them pay for those projects that they did during that moratorium. And then House Bill 365, this one is a returning bill that it was introduced last year. This creates a statewide facility condition report so that the state can really get an idea of a 10-year plan for, in the next 10 years, what are the projects that are coming up? What do districts think that they need to focus on? Where will the needs be so that they can really start to plan out a long-term school building aid plan to try to help meet districts' needs? And so those are the biggest pieces with school building aid. There are a couple of other ones, dealing with applications and that sort of thing. But those four are the really biggest ones in terms of school building aid. This is an issue that comes up really every year, but especially around state budget time. So we're watching this one pretty closely because there's a lot of need in the state. And so, how will the state address, what's necessary on the ground? And so now we'll shift gears to our other key theme, which is school vouchers. This is it's a big issue. It's a big topic this year. It's going to be a big focus of our work and really of the education policy groups at the state. So there are a number of bills dealing with school vouchers. And so, just to give a quick overview, this year, the state school voucher program will cost taxpayers $14.7 million. In total, over the past 2 years since its inception, the state will have spent $23 million in school vouchers. That is a significant amount of money for, a small state like New Hampshire. And I think what's really important to know about that figure is that over 3/4 of those dollars are going to students who were already enrolled in private schools or who were homeschooled. So we don't see a lot of students leaving their public schools for these school vouchers. What's really happening is families who are already in, students who are already enrolled in private schools or families who already homeschool are seeking these school vouchers to subsidize those decisions that they've made. And so a lot of those public funds are really going to those families. One other piece that's important to know as we start talking about school voucher bills is that there is a lawsuit. So somebody had sued the state. The lawsuit challenges that the statewide school voucher program delegates the state's responsibility to educate children to a third-party independent company. So one of the big themes of the lawsuit is that the state is required. There have been a number of Supreme Court cases that have shown that have affirmed that the state has a responsibility to educate all school-age children in New Hampshire. And this lawsuit is challenging that, saying that this is really delegating that responsibility to this third-party company. It also is arguing that it's an illegal and improper use of education trust fund dollars. So those dollars are legally designated for public schools, whether those are district schools or charter schools. But this is not a public school. This is not a charter school. And so it's challenging that piece of it. There is that bill, HB 440, that we had talked about earlier, that, that is, lawmakers have proposed for this session, but that's something, that's another piece of that lawsuit. And then in terms of cost, we had talked about how it's cost $23 million so far in the past 2 years. It is worth noting that in December, the New Hampshire Department of Education presented its proposed budget to a panel of budget writers. And the department expects the voucher program will cost nearly $30 million in FY24 and another $30 million in FY25, which is significantly more than initially proposed. It's also really important to note that currently the Department of Education, they can estimate how much the program will cost, but the state is responsible for 100% of that cost, even if it goes over budget. There is no requirement right now that mandates that the program stay within budget. If whatever the amount is of school vouchers, the state has to pay it. There is no cap right now. So that's something to keep in mind. But it is interesting to see where the New Hampshire Department of Ed expects the program to go. So they're expecting it to really double between this year and next year. So that's something that we will be watching pretty closely as well. There are a number of bills to expand eligibility for the school voucher program. One of them is House Bill 464. Important to know about this bill is that this has the same language as the proposed expansion that the Department of Education proposed to budget writers in December. So when they had provided their budget, they recommended an expansion, and this seems to be the vehicle in which they would pursue that expansion. It's unclear. I did ask the department. I'm waiting to hear back on that. But so we're waiting for some more details, both about, is this the department's expansion, and then also some of the details of it. But House Bill 464 would significantly expand eligibility. So there would be that income cap, that's 300% of the federal poverty guideline, which this year, 2023, is $90,000 for a family of 4. It would also expand to any child that has a disability, regardless of income, multilingual students, regardless of income. And then there are a couple of other categories that are interesting. In foster care, they have a status as a migratory child. They're experiencing homelessness. And then I think one that sticks out for me personally is they're eligible for school meals. And I think that's interesting for me because the income cap is less than 300% of the federal poverty guideline. To be eligible for school meals, it's 185% of the federal poverty guideline. So they're already eligible. So it's unclear why they would put that in the statute. So that's something that I'll be listening for when this goes for a hearing tomorrow is, what's the goal there? Another eligibility category is a parent who's a member of the armed forces, lives within the quote geographic boundary of a CSI school. CSI schools, these are comprehensive support and improvement schools. These are schools that they're quote at risk. So they have low graduation rates, or they have some of the lowest test scores in the state. What's interesting about this piece is that 14 of the 23 identified, 8 of the 23 identified CSI schools are charter schools. And so it's unclear, and I've asked for clarification on this, of if a charter school is in, say, Nashua, does that mean that all Nashua students, regardless of whether they attend that charter school, would they be eligible for a school voucher? And so there's a lot of murkiness in this. And so, we're waiting for clarification. There is that public hearing tomorrow at 9:30 in House Education. So hopefully we'll hear some more details there. But I think one thing that I've seen most about, one of the biggest themes with this school voucher expansion that I've seen, it's really twofold. One, it seems to be an expansion based on geography. So some of the other pieces, they are addressed in either other pieces of statute, or like the eligible for school meals, some of these students are already eligible. So it's unclear why they're pointing this out now. But it really seems to be an expansion based on geography, because of that lives within a geographic boundary of a CSI school. There are a couple of other pieces as well that hint towards that, but it's really making broad swaths of students based on location eligible and increasing it that way, and just doing it in a sort of roundabout way. So that's we're waiting for more information on that. There are other pieces as well. Has a documented manifest educational hardship, persistently bullied. Those indicators, it's important to know that, students get a manifest educational hardship so that they can get a transfer. They can get a different school assignment. And so those students are already going to other places. They're already assigned to different schools. And so I think one thing I'll be looking out for tomorrow at the public hearing is more clarity on the intent of this program. There are two other broad expansion bills, House Bill 367, which would increase the income eligibility for the school vouchers. So currently, as I had mentioned, to be eligible, it's 300. It would have to be a family income of less than 300% of the federal poverty guideline, which is $90,000 for a family of four. House Bill 367 would increase that to 500% of the federal poverty guideline, which is $150,000 for a family of four. So that is a pretty significant expansion. It would nearly double eligibility. So right now, just over 30% of school-aged youth in New Hampshire are expected to qualify. We don't know the exact number because, New Hampshire doesn't collect, we don't have an income tax, so we don't collect that data. But according to census data, we estimate that currently about 30% of students qualify. This would increase it to about 64% of students who would qualify. And so when we talk about, there are 16,000 private school students, about 3,500 homeschool students. So that's a significant expansion of that program. And then House Bill 331 just removes income eligibility entirely. So the only eligibility requirement is that the student has to be a resident of New Hampshire and eligible to enroll in a public elementary or secondary school. So that, again, that's an even bigger expansion, but those two are income-based expansions. Another piece that we're looking at that is a return from last year are the locally funded school vouchers. This is returning as House Bill 538. It establishes a locally funded school voucher program. It is important to know that local voters would have to opt into this program. It requires a 3/5 majority vote on a school warrant article in order to pass. But if it does, these vouchers would be locally funded from local school district budgets. They would be limited to twice the per pupil adequate education grant. So right now, each schools receive about $3,800 this year per student from the state, plus any differentiated aid. And so the local school voucher would be twice that. And the way that the bill is written, it's intended that the local school district would still receive the state adequate education dollars for that student. The idea being that the state and the district would, quote, split the cost, is how I've heard it referred to, but those still would come out of the district budget. Important implications, though, if they are still technically enrolled as a resident district, a student in that district, what happens to who's responsible for special education services? You know, if that student enrolls in a private school, what happens there? So there are a lot of open questions there, but it's one that we will be watching pretty closely. This one doesn't have a public hearing scheduled yet, and so we'll be watching that pretty closely. Some other school voucher bills. House Bill 430 would repeal the school voucher program altogether. House Bill 573 would limit it to budgeted amounts. So whatever the state passes as the budget for it, that would effectively cap participation in the school voucher program. House Bill 626 would shift the administration of the program. Right now, it's under the third-party Children's Scholarship Fund. This would require the New Hampshire Department of Education to administer the voucher program. So Children's Scholarship Fund retains a maximum of 10% per school voucher for administrative fees. This would shift that responsibility onto the state. House Bill 515 is one that we are also watching. So it would not only would it allow school voucher funds to be used to pay for courses at public schools, but it changes a couple of other pieces of the statute. So right now, in order for misuse to have to be reported, it has to be substantial. House Bill 515 would change that to intentional and substantial. And we heard a lot when this bill was originally proposed in 2021, that intentional bar is very high. That is a very high bar to cross, to have to report, which is why they removed intentional and only put substantial, because it's really hard to prove intentional misuse. Other states have had a number of problems with misuse of voucher funds. And so, you know, removing that language 2 years ago was really to make sure that families are using these in the ways that were intended. So adding intentional, it may give some problems in what can be referred. And then it also adds an organizational requirement to report misuse. The scholarship organization would be required to report misuse to the Attorney General. Right now, they don't have to. It's a may in the statute. They may refer to the Attorney General. So that would change it to a requirement. And then it adds a number of other reporting requirements. And so there are a couple of other bills, but these are really the biggest ones that we are watching in terms of the school voucher program. In terms of divisive concepts and school climate, there are a number of bills. A lot of these are, they're getting a lot of attention. House Bill 61, this one repeals the divisive concepts law. We have heard a lot from educators on the ground, from school administrators, from the public, from parents around just how challenging the divisive concepts law has been in the classroom. This would repeal that law. It did have a public hearing last week, and the support for the bill far outweighed the opposition. So I believe it was about 1,200 people signed in support of the bill, and I think it was 74 opposed. So we're seeing a lot of support for the repeal of the bill. House Bill 533 would allow the New Hampshire Department of Education to sue school districts on behalf of an individual. That one is a very interesting bill. It doesn't have a public hearing scheduled yet, but it'll be interesting to hear what the sponsor says in terms of, the intent of the bill and that kind of thing, because that could open quite a few doors. House Bill 10 is a return, although it is a bit different. That establishes a parental bill of rights. Lawmakers tried to pass one last year, and it failed. They've brought it back again. I think it's slightly different. We're still working through a side-by-side of it, a comparison of what has changed. I know that there are a lot of other groups who are really spearheading work on that, though. House Bill 629 would establish a student bill of rights. And so this one, so we see a parental bill of rights and then we see a student bill of rights. And so that, the conversations around those are going to be super interesting. House Bill 619. This one I am hearing a lot of discussion on, and I do really want to raise it because it does, it has a number of other, it is a very long bill. A lot of the other pieces of it have to do with non-education related issues, but it does have, it would have a significant impact on public schools, public and charter schools. So it prohibits educators from using names other than what the student is enrolled as. It bans certain discussions around gender and pronouns. It does a number of other things. And so, you know, we're seeing a big trend nationally around this type of bill, and we're seeing it here in New Hampshire as House Bill 619. And so that's what that we'll be watching as well. In terms of strengthening and diversifying the educator workforce, this is a big piece that we've been working on this. We've been watching it since late last summer, when there was a legislative committee to study the teacher shortage and make recommendations. They did issue 4 different recommendations, and we're starting to see those bills come through. House Bill 623 would create a teacher loan forgiveness program. LSR 2023-1022 would establish a rural and underserved educator incentive program to encourage people to teach in rural and underserved areas. And then LSR 2023-1023 is an interesting one for us. This establishes a salary floor for public school teachers. It is a Senate bill and we don't have language for it yet, but it is one that we're watching pretty closely because this one isn't necessarily one that came out of the committee, but it's one that, you know, it's interesting for sure. There was a lot of conversation around teacher pay and how it is relatively low compared to other states. And so, you know, seeing what's in that bill, we'll be watching pretty closely. So switching gears a little bit to the overhaul of the minimum standards for public school approval. If you've been following us for a while, this has been a huge issue area for us. These are the foundational rules for our public schools. And so we are watching them very, very closely. There has been a tremendous amount of concern with the department's handling of this overhaul, both in the process, who they've included, who they haven't, and in the actual draft itself. So the draft was released in July 2022. You can see the 5 key themes here. There are a lot of concerns with what's in them. But we know that we have heard that they're expected to go before the state board in February or in March. A representative told a legislative oversight committee last week that a draft would be available for public viewing last Friday. And then they backtracked that earlier this week and said, no, it won't be available until it's actually released to the state board. And so we are watching that pretty closely because there have been quite a few concerns. They would be extremely consequential to our public schools. One piece of legislation that is relevant is House Bill 371. This establishes a commission to evaluate and recommend standards for public schools. So it would really be a restart of the process. So there's been a tremendous amount of concern with the process. Who was at the table, who wasn't allowed to be at the table. There were a number of people who were missing from the conversation. And this would restart the program with a broader commission of people with a lot more representation, and open a transparent process to try to really think about what are the existing rules, what needs changing, and then recommend those changes. So it would be a much more transparent process, similar to other rulemaking processes like the one that created the academic standards for Holocaust and genocide studies. That one was very open, and I think this one was really modeled after that. And so just to wrap up, thinking about some other bills of interest, and again, there are a ton of other bills that we are watching, but we're closing in on the hour, so I'm going pretty quick here. There are a number of bills regarding charter schools that's increasing funding for them, having to do with their access to school building aid, processes for dissolution. There are a number of bills regarding school boards, board member eligibility, their organization, their administration, their things having to do with right to know and that kind of thing. We're seeing a lot of bills having to do with curriculum and assessment. So whether that's bills mandating teaching about communism, mandating teaching cursive handwriting, or, requiring certain teaching about readings and using certain types of reading assessments, creating incentive grants for schools to improve test scores, things like that. We are waiting on a number of bills from the Senate side having to do with the statewide assessment program, but that's a big theme that we're seeing. As well as, mental health and wellness. There's also a bill that eliminates residency requirements. So this is House Bill 441. This would remove residency requirements for schools, makes changes to the laws regarding public school reassignment. So, students wouldn't be required to be assigned to the school in which they live. It looks like it might be a sort of an open enrollment model, which opens a lot of questions for a number of different reasons. So that's one that we're looking at pretty closely. And then finally, there are a lot of bills around school meals and food security. So House Bill 572, for example, it would increase the eligibility for school meals. House Bill 601 would require the state to participate in the Medicaid direct certification program, which would increase participation in school meals, and would really make sure that that kids are fed, and that they have that food security, at least within the school. So those are sort of bills that we're also watching. Wrapping up, in terms of how to participate, there are a number of ways to participate this year. You can do it in person at the location of the public hearing, usually that they're at the Legislative Office Building, which is right behind the State House. Sometimes for bigger bills, they do hold them in the State House in Reps Hall, which is always fun because that's a great room to be, and it's exciting. There all of those paintings and stuff. It's a super cool place. But in person you can participate, you can testify. There's written testimony. You could submit it to the House Education Committee or through the online portal, or you can also support or oppose legislation without written testimony. So you can just say, yes, I support, or yes, I oppose. You don't have to write anything or anything like that. There are portals online that you can do that. So there are a variety of ways for people to participate this year. We are usually in the LOB whenever there are hearings. So if you're there, stop by and say hi. Would love to see you. I'd love to chat. So, and just to really wrap up, there are a couple of things to remember. House Education and Senate Education, they tend to meet on Tuesdays. All of their meetings are live streamed on YouTube, unless they're like in a wildly different place, but they're generally streamed on YouTube. We're getting into a super busy area. So around Valentine's Day is when the governor releases his proposed budget. April 6th is crossover. So really everything in each house has to be done by April 6th. Then it sort of transfers over. And then by June 29th, that's the last day to vote on Committee of Conference reports. We're done. It's summertime. And I mean, if all things go well, so best laid plans. So all in all, things between now and June 29th, things move very, very quickly. So I would encourage you to, if you're interested in following these things, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and really sign up for the New Hampshire Education Network. I think that's probably the best way at this point, because we do send out those weekly emails that recap the following week and really give you an idea of what's happening in the week to come. And we also really contextualize some of the key legislative pieces. So, there's a school voucher bill. What do you need to know about it? What's the research say, and those kinds of things. And then finally, on that note, with the school vouchers, we are hosting a webinar next Thursday from 1 to 2 p.m. on school vouchers. I know that there's a lot to cover. There is a lot more to cover, and it just would have been impossible to do in this broad brushstroke of a session. So we have a dedicated hour next week that we will be talking about school vouchers. You can register online for that. If you have any questions that you want me to answer in that webinar or offline, please email me. I am always available on email. I try not to be so much on the weekends, but sometimes that doesn't work out. But if there are pieces that you think that we should cover and that kind of thing. If you have any questions, would love to hear them. But that hour is really going to be dedicated to the school voucher program. I'm also expecting that we'll host other ones on school funding and some of the other big topics that we had talked about. And so finally, just one more plug for the New Hampshire Education Network. That's that bit.ly/NHED network. Sign up for it. You'll get those emails. You can unsubscribe if you want, but you get those every week. And then if there's something super important, like, oh my goodness, this hearing got changed, or, you know, this is a midweek change or whatever it is, or we have this burning hot analysis that we want out, we usually send it to the network first. So you're usually the first to know. And with that, sorry for talking super fast. There is a lot to cover. This is very exciting. But my email is here. Feel free to email me. Our Facebook, our Twitter handle. We are relatively new on Instagram, but our website always has our current stuff on it as well. Just to reiterate, this is recorded. And so if you dropped off or if you want to rewatch it, you can find it on YouTube. So just one more plug. Thank you very much for coming. We really appreciate it. All right. And with that, I think we can end it, right?